We've had the Unit 1 exam last June. Can I just have a show of hands? How many of you put people in for Unit 1 at the end of Year 10? Interesting. Yeah, that's about average for the country, about sort of, I think, about 40% of schools, somewhere around that mark, put people in for Unit 1 at the end of Year 10. And what you're going to get today from me is some reflection on that, and also looking forward, obviously, to the examination next summer, Unit 2A/2B. Now, with that in mind, we will also be looking at legacy results from last year and what happened in that paper, because the message that you're going to get today, and you'll have had throughout this new specification, is although we're looking at more texts and the exams are in a different structure, very much of what's happening here, although this is a new specification now, is the same as what we've done before. So, you know, this gives you continuity in terms of resources, it gives you continuity in terms of teaching your candidates to do well. If you're teaching them to do well on legacy, as you have been, you've been preparing them well for Unit 2A/2B. You know, it's the same kind of thing. So we'll look at that today. Now, some reflections, perhaps first of all, on what happened last summer with Unit 1. You know, we were interested to see what happened with Year 10s coming in and doing their poetry comparison and their different cultures text. Yes, the majority of them did Mice and Men. They didn't all. We saw some of all the texts, which was really nice to see. And I'll just make some general reflections. I was really, really impressed, we all were, by some of the candidates and some of what they did, as indeed we always are on legacy, I have to say. But what seemed to be an advantage to some in taking this at the end of Year 10 was that they were very, very engaged with the texts. They seemed to know them back to front. It sort of reminded me of a bit non-PC perhaps, but the old days when they had a bit more time and fewer GCSEs or O-levels or whatever they were, you know, when they had a bit of time to read a book. And that looked to have happened. It occurred to me that maybe some of them had a few less exams than you get at the end of Year 11. A bit more time to get into the book, and perhaps some more teaching time for it as well, maybe. And as a result, they did very well. As you probably know, we were pleased with the results. The results were good for Unit 1 Lit. Which suggests that it's a sensible idea to do it at the end of Year 10. You're thinking of your current cohort, and if that's in your plans, then, you know, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. There are other reasons for that, obviously, which is that it ties in, you know, if you do your extended literary text on, let's say, Mice and Men or Mockingbird or whatever it might be, you can get that controlled assessment done, you can get the exam out of the way, and then you can say Mice and Men, put it on the shelf, ready to pass on to your younger brother or sister in a couple of years, or sell to one of your mates. Don't put it in the bin, because they need it later, obviously, but it's going to come back again. But that's one way of that text getting out of their minds, and then you've got two to concentrate on in Year 11. The other way it worked, there was, you know, we were worried about maturation and issues, and would some of them not have the same sort of skills that they could demonstrate in Year 11. On occasion, this showed, but it seemed to be more in terms of centres. There were centres that didn't seem as well prepared as others, in my view. And the ways typically this would show was things that we're familiar with. They weren't sort of pulling out detail and then talking about it. So let's bring that to an example. They talk about George. You know, it's just one of the questions on Mice and Men, and they just talk about him generally for 3 or 4 sides. You know, George is nice, George isn't nice, George is this, George is that, without bringing any sort of detailed reference or support to the text. And I was a bit frustrated because I could see that the kids knew the book, but they just didn't quite have the skills to write an exam essay, really. So that was what I would have expected, and I did see a bit of that, but perhaps not anywhere near as much as was expected, which was good. The extract was on Slim for Mice and Men. Now we've got on to Mice and Men. And that raised some interesting sort of questions, because the ones that knew the text did it really well. It was one of those where within the first sort of paragraph you knew, you know, whether they'd got it or not. And a lot of them really did know the book and really did get who Slim was, and were able to use that extract well to demonstrate how he'd been presented. Others didn't seem to know who he was particularly well, and again, this seemed to go by teaching group perhaps, or even by centre. And, you know, maybe there are groups out there who've seen the film and read the book very quickly, and, you know, maybe they're the ones that don't know Slim as well. Now, that's a fairly obvious thing to say, and it wasn't why we picked Slim. We're not trying to trip people up. But you do have to be very wary, I think, of how you teach, whichever text you're going to use for Unit 1. I say that because I taught myself part-time last year on this new spec, and we did Unit 1 at the end of Year 10. And we were left with an interesting situation. We did Mice and Men, and our controlled assessment was going to be about crooks. So we've got, you know, sort of March, we're looking at it again, and on our scheme of work, it had controlled assessment, crooks, exam, you know, in that order. I looked at that again and I thought, hang on a sec, I'm not sure, you know, and also we were running out of time, surprise, surprise. So we decided to reverse that. What we actually did was prepared them on the text as a whole. Yes, we talked about crooks as we went through, but we didn't put a massive special emphasis on crooks. They didn't know their controlled assessment title at that stage. So we studied the whole text, then went into the exam. Then when they came back, we said, right, 3 weeks now, let's get this controlled assessment done on crooks. Okay. Now, obviously you can do that either way around. The danger is, if your controlled assessment task is quite specific, they could go into the exam with that at the front of their heads. That's, you know, they might be lucky, and that might work quite well for them, but they might not. And I think it's quite hard to teach a text if you know that they're going to be doing a specific, you know, if you're teaching to controlled assessment, I think it's quite hard to teach that text without putting a bit of emphasis on, you know, on specific things, if you know that's what they're going to be doing in their controlled assessment. So maybe, although it's completely up to you, maybe the model that we eventually got to where I was is a good one, where you do the exam and you get to the controlled assessment straight after, it's all still fresh in their minds, they've got knowledge of the text, then you focus it in, wrap it all up, and off we go. Yeah? In terms of unseen poetry, the comparisons were done really well. There's one, I think actually at this point I'm going to have to go to the book. I'm trying to give you all the intro stuff, and I never get through it without getting into detail. Let's start going through the book, and I'll point this out to you. But we're going to go fairly backwards. So if we have a look at page 36 in booklet 9. This is the foundation poetry comparison from last summer's exam, yeah? Quiz question for you. You can do better, you can win the Wars of the Roses and outdo Liverpool if you can get this in under 15 seconds. Which is the most important line on this whole page? Which is the one that you want to tell the kids they have to get first? Which is the single most important line on this whole page, on page 36?
Question.
The question. What's the question? The bit in bold?
Yeah.
The bit in bold? Nope. No. There's one that's even more important for them to notice than that.
1 hour section.
No.
Each poem second.
Gold star, you win. Can you repeat it for us?
Both poems describe people's reactions to people who don't fit into society.
Yes. Why is that the most important line on the page?
That's the first
Telling what these poems are about.
Yes, and because then you see the first 10 answers as an examiner, you forget it's there, and when they say, both poems describe people's reactions, people who don't fit into society, put a big tick and give them 3 marks. No, you don't, because then you remember that it's there. But the point being that, particularly for foundation, but for both tiers, this is absolutely crucial. I would like to put that in font 28, bold, flashing, scratch and sniff, flashing lights, anything I could to make them actually see it. There was a poem we did on the legacy about 3 or 4 years ago, or whenever, because I've been doing this quite a while, called In the Can, which was about being in prison in America. And we glossed the title, we put underneath, In the Can is an Americanism for being in prison in America. And I put that sheet like this in front of a whole class of decent Year 11s last year and said, what's the title about? And none of them could find the gloss, none of them could see it. They're blind to things like this is my point. And it's really important that in your teaching, with the comparison, you make them aware that there will be a specific link put in there for them, and that is a great place for them to start. Because, for instance, what then doesn't happen is what happened with some of these, for Down and Out Paddington Station, which was the supposedly more accessible poem because it's on the foundation paper. It is, you know, a nice straightforward poem, and they did very well, but some said that this is about somebody who's been shopping. You know, about, you know, I know this will happen, and I'm not taking the mickey at them. They're going to do things like this. But if they'd read that first thing, they're probably going to get, you know, and we might have made it even more obvious next time and said something about, you know, homelessness or something, so that they've got that tag, so they don't think this is about somebody who, you know, spent too much on Oxford Street and can't get home and, you know, has got somewhere to go at midnight, and all these kinds of misinterpretations that they can fall into. Because what's sort of frustrating with that is that one that I saw recently on a inquiry about results, somebody had done that. They'd written about Paddington Station, then the other poem. Then when they got onto their comparative section, they'd then sussed why the two poems were together. They later on got the idea that these were both about homeless people. But by then, they've gone through so much of their time writing fairly irrelevant stuff. Do you see my point? So it's really essential that they get that. I've probably gone on about it long enough now. You'll notice there that I talked about the typical structure to a comparison response. As you would have had probably from Stuart this morning, you know he's with the controlled assessment on poetry linking, as it is there. You know, anything like that, we as a board generally suggest they talk about one, talk about the other, then do some comparison. Now, with this exam, generally speaking, that is the most successful approach, I would say, adopted by candidates. That they talk about one poem, they talk about the other, and then they give you a little bit of comparison. Okay. Now, a lot of them will do one, and as soon as they start on the second one, they'll refer it back to what they've said about the first. Not a problem. That's great. You know, don't worry if that's what's happening in practice tasks and things. As long as they're talking about both, it doesn't matter. Yesterday or today even, I saw a really good integrated one. You know, there are candidates who can write about both as they go through and make a good job of it. You know, they're not going to lose marks for taking that approach. If they can show the skills, they'll get awarded the marks. It's just that, on the whole, the most successful method is to write about one and then write about the other. Yeah? Which brings us, I suppose, to teaching of this. How do you prepare them for doing a poetry comparison on an exam paper? Particularly if you've been used to unseen poetry with us before, how is this any different? Or even if you haven't, how do you go about teaching unseen poetry? And when you're looking at schemes of work, when I'm going into schools these days, they're saying, how long should we spend on unseen poetry? You know, because it's, you know, we get there and we've hardly any time left. And to a degree, the longer you teach it for, the worse it will be, you know, because you don't want to overload them with technical terms that they then struggle to apply in a useful manner. What you want them to do is to focus on the task with this. My own advice, the way I would approach teaching this, is I would immediately go to the vast bank of resources online or your existing CPD from past years where you've got copies of past papers of ours. You know, I'd even go to last summer's paper. If I had a higher group sitting this in January, I'd get 0 hour, the legacy poem from last summer on higher, and I'd get the sheet and I'd put it in front of them and I'd give them half an hour without any preparation necessarily, and I'd say, do that, let's see where you are with this. With poetry, with unseen poetry, you really don't need nasty surprises. You need to have a good idea of what they're going to do in the exam. You know, so if you do that first of all with a single poem, then you get them to evaluate what they've done, you know, do whatever you're going to do in the room, compare it in groups, however you want to go about that, and gradually build the skills, perhaps over 2 or 3 lessons and 2 or 3 poems, until they can look at one poem effectively. I wouldn't even introduce, personally, comparison until you've got that down. For 2 reasons. One is it's easier, and the other one is that they've then got the skills on board so that they will then sort of automatically do one and then the other in the exam, because they know that, oh, we've got to do that. And that's the most you can hope for from your candidates with this, if they've not done it before, is that they go into the exam thinking, I know what I've got to do, I've got to write about one poem, then the other, I've got my link, that's where I'm going with it, you know, in terms of comparison. Okay. And I do think that practicing in terms of, you know, half hour in exam conditions in the classroom is extremely effective for this stuff, for all literature exams actually. You know, you don't have to be sitting massive mock papers because we've got more papers now. Do you need more mocks? You know, you've got a lot going on. There's a lot going on in this spec with English and Lit together, language and Lit together. So I would probably look at, you know, breaking this down into little bits in the classroom and doing bits of papers and honing their skills on the different kind of tasks. Okay. Let's see if I've missed any of the general messages. Both reports will be on the website very soon. It says here they might be there by now, I'm not sure. The Unit 1 report, you've just heard some of what I've had to say about that. It will tell you about every individual text and how those went. The vast majority for that paper will do Mice and Men. The other books work fantastically well, if that's what you know, if you're that way inclined, shall we say, you know, if you've got the time and the kids who can handle Mockingbird, for instance, then go for it because they'll do fantastically well, you know, if you can do it properly in the time that you've got. So all texts work as ever, less texts on that paper, but also going online is the legacy report. And as I said a few minutes ago, that's going to be useful to you when you're preparing for Unit 2A, 2B. Now, that's the one that they're all going to have to sit in the summer. That's the one where you choose, as I'm sure you're aware, a mixture of sort of old prose and new drama, or old drama and new prose. You've got to match those up. That's not a centre decision. You could be doing different ones in teaching groups. One room might be doing Silas Marner and, what would that be? Maybe Be My Baby. And in the other room they might be doing In Spectacles and About a Boy. You know, it doesn't matter. You don't have to do one paper as a centre. Okay, you can mix and match there and look at that. The question types are going to be exactly the same as on the legacy paper, and indeed current Unit 1 papers. So that's where the legacy report comes in really useful. Some of the texts are already on the legacy specification, but more to the point, all the question types are on the legacy specification. Okay, now, right at the back of the booklet, if you have a look on pages 40 to 43, you've got a make your own exam paper kit there. In other words, you've got the frames of lots of the questions that we use. Okay, those are typical of the question types that you're going to get. You will still find on the papers, looking on page 40, just under the second heading, Essays Character, the third one there, Imagine You Are Blank. Okay, so last summer on the legacy paper we had Imagine You Are Mrs. Burling. Yeah, imagine you're Mrs. Burling. At the end of the play, you think back over its events, write down your thoughts and feelings, remember how Mrs. Burling would speak and you write your answer. Okay, that is what we call an empathy question, yes? I'm familiar with them. They are going to be in future papers. That may not have been sort of apparent through at the beginning of the specification, but they will be there. So everything that's in the current legacy will be there. Now, we probably haven't got time to go into a massive talk about whether empathy is a useful thing or not. I think for some students it works incredibly well. But I think if I'm teaching that, I get them to practice it in class. And last year, I had one student who was an elected mute, actually, and her empathy essay on Mice and Men was the best piece of work I've ever seen her do. It was fantastic. And I sort of thought, I wonder if that's a coincidence, because it's first person and it's expressive, you know, and it removed so many barriers for that particular child for writing about a character. She just seemed to get it instantly, you know. And then there are other people in the same room who didn't do very well with the practice empathy task. So, you know, advise them, say, because it's not always going to be an empathy question. If an empathy question comes up, yes, I think that would suit you, or maybe no, that wouldn't suit you. If you can get that far, that's quite a good place to be in, I think. There will never be two, so you've got a choice of essay questions on any text, and it will never be that you have to imagine you're this person or that person. There will always be one, traditional, if you want to call it that, more traditional kind of character or thematic question where they can exercise the skills a bit differently. Okay? Right. So we have a look through the booklet itself. I think that's probably the next place to go. Okay. Oh, one more thing before we do that. Social context. That funny drug called AO4, I think it's called, isn't it? That one. AO4 is examined, is assessed in the different cultures paper because it's a different cultures paper. Okay. I didn't see a lot of... we've really been banging that message home throughout from the very beginning. I did see I had one centre, I think, with Unit 1 who very many of the candidates told me all about John Steinbeck's childhood and how he knew about the Dust Bowl. The only thing that I'm going to say, redundancy is the key word there. It's the fact that they've spent their time in the exam place telling me some background which, unless it's linked to the text, is not useful. Linked to the text, fantastic. As a preparatory 3 paragraphs, I'm thinking, get to your essay, It's not we don't take marks off, but we can't value that very highly on its own. Exactly the same issue there as with unseen poetry, with the overuse of technical effects. It's the idea that if they list, this poem's got 3 alliterations, this one hasn't got any. I saw one that went on for pages like that this year. That's just redundant, because unless they can say why, it's just meaningless, really. And the same is true about writing lots about the social background without saying how that affects the events and characters in the novel. Extract questions. The formula for any of the exam papers is always the same. We recommend an hour on each text, so you're talking 20 minutes for an extract question and 40 minutes on the essay question. Now that is, as it always has been, is because they get a maximum of 10 marks for the extract and they get a maximum of 20 marks for the essay. So, it makes sense to spend twice as much time on the essay as on the extract. Now, foundation, one little note on foundation, again we did say this last year, but to remind you, foundation extract questions now will not be in 2 parts. There used to be 2 parts to foundation extract, so it might say, what do you think of the way George behaves here, what do you think of the way Lenny behaves here? That will no longer happen. It will be 1 part, and was indeed on the summer Unit 1 paper. That's the only real change we've made in terms of question construction. We did that because candidates on foundation were writing phenomenal amounts on, we did it originally, we put 2 parts in originally to give them something to latch onto, but you know what I'm saying, it then went too far because we were spending too much time on it. So, we're now going to just that then. Okay, extract questions. The ideal extract essay, response I should say, the ideal extract response will do 2 things. It will tell you what's happened in that extract and how that's been achieved, but it will also a little bit of contextualising. It's not, going to be always very, very subtle contextualising. I'll give you an example. Last summer's Of Mice and Men extract was the bit when Lenny's throwing away the pup, and it's after he's killed Curly's wife. And I saw candidates who wrote some really good essays on even Curly and Curly's wife's relationship, which is one of the essay questions. And they wrote all about how he doesn't see her until she's dead in the book, and da-da-da-da-da. Nice detailed knowledge of the whole text. But when they wrote about the extract, they said, oh, it looks like somebody's died here, as if it were unseen, as if it was a surprise to them. And I thought, why have they done that? And I thought, well, they must be doing that because that's what they think they've got to do. So this is why I'm feeding it back to you, because I think if they think that's what they've got to do, then that's a shame, because they knew. I could see from the rest of their response on my submit that they knew that Lenny had killed Curly's wife. And as a marker, you end up writing things like, we know. When it says, we think Lenny may have killed Curly's wife. Yes, we know. That's so. The sensible approach is to say, when they see it, this is just after Lenny has killed Curly's wife in the barn. Just that. That's a little bit of contextualising, isn't it? A simple, straightforward piece of contextualising. Even something that direct is a starting point. That can be built on in that when they're perhaps saying that he throws, I'll throw the pup away and it won't be as bad, I can't remember the exact words, but you know what I mean, those lines. Some of them will say, this reminds us of Lenny's confusion because he doesn't know the difference, he thinks it's going to be all right if he gets rid of the evidence of the pup, even though there's a dead woman lying on the floor. Brilliant. Now we're getting into higher bands, aren't we then, and higher grades on higher papers usually. But what they can still support that with a bit of contextualising, because the best ones, or some of them, will then say something like, this is particularly weird because Lenny was always so eager to see the pups in the rest of the book. Yeah? This is something that's now become worthless to him, so thrown it away. So they'll relate it in some way to the rest of the book. But the way to do the extracts is to balance those two things. What you don't want is for them to just tell you the story of the extract without any contextualising. But you also want them to talk about the extract. So they don't just, for instance, one on Slim, if they just start by saying, Slim is someone who talks to George throughout the book and he gets to know him and da-da-da-da-da, and they're doing an essay on Slim because you've asked about Slim. They need to talk about the extract. Okay? They need to talk about the content to, again, select and highlight, select and discuss. Those are the real foundations of C and above. When they can do that, that's where you want them all to start. To say, this bit's there because, this bit's there. Yeah? So get them to select, but also get them to talk wider if they can. Okay. There's some tips there, which is second person on page 2, so that's something you can obviously share with candidates if you wish to. Let's have a quick look. We've then got on pages 3 and 4 the Maya Angelou Know Why the Caged Bird Sings bit from the Unit 1 paper. We've got a sample response on page 5. Just wanted to go through just this first paragraph of this with you to reinforce the point I've just made, really. Angelou creates mood and atmosphere in this passage, in the first sentence, by saying, last inch of space was filled, yet people continued to wedge themselves. This creates an atmosphere of desperation, as she says that even if there was no room, people still tried to get in, which shows importance in the event. I'm marking that, I'm giving that a big tick. I'm saying you've selected and you have discussed. It's a valid point, It's, to be honest, straight away I'm thinking, you keep doing that, you're going to be hitting at least C. That's what I'm thinking in my head when I'm marking that. Okay? What would I have liked to have seen to boost that up? What am I looking to get that up a whole band, probably? Well, what I'm looking for is for them to say what the event is. If they could say this is, and the event that we're actually talking about here is the radio broadcast of a Joe Louis fight. So all the Negro community are crushed into the shop, and it's an important event in the book, an important event to the community. If they can give it a little bit of contextualising in terms of the book, they're then going to be going up, So it's that's what you need to look at, is that ability to, at that level, get the decent marks and then top it up. If you're looking at the top, you need to be able to top it up in that kind of way. All right? I'll tell you at this point, with all these examples, you've got another booklet called Booklet 10. Don't go running for it now, but that's there, so that's got marked versions of everything by Margaret Graham, the Chief Examiner, so you can see the way we annotate, if you haven't seen that before. and you can see the marks, the bands that all these exemplars are placed in, okay? So that's for you to use as you wish. We always give you the blank ones, obviously, so you can use them with kids if they want to have a go at marking that themselves. That's another thing, particularly with shorter things like extracts, I've always found really useful is getting them to mark them. You know, give them the criteria, say, what is this out of 10? There's not that many marks out of 10, so they can't be massively wrong. But they're usually very harsh, and they usually give something that we would give 6, they might give it 3, and you can say, no, actually, that's a bit better than that. And then, they can think, oh, this is a bit more achievable than I thought it was. And they need to, when possible, be aware of exactly what we're looking for in there. It's not as straightforward, perhaps, as language when you can say, make a point, Sometimes there's this sort of mysticism still around it, or what are we actually looking for? So if you can get them to say what they want to be to select and discuss, they've got something then that they can go and do directly, and you can show them how to do that by other people's examples. Okay. Pages 6 and 7. That's a comparison between foundation and higher. So you've got the Unit 1 questions on mice and men from foundation and higher on the same page. Interesting for you to see the differences when you're looking at entry. You are aware, I'm sure, that you could, of course, where we've got 2 exams, it would be very possible for you to enter them foundation on one and higher on the other. Now, the only reason the most probable reason for doing that I would imagine be based on the results from the first paper that they take, which is going to be Unit 1. So if they take Unit 1 at the end of Year 10, perhaps you enter for foundation and they do phenomenally well. You might think, actually, I might go for higher in Year 11. But you might not. You might think they've done really well because of the support that the foundation paper gives them. That's a decision for you to make, but there is that option. What they're getting in foundation are the bullets. Now, particularly on essay questions, they are only on essay questions, but on essay questions, the bullets are useful, but I think you need to be aware that on occasion they can be a little bit restrictive because they think, they're subheadings, which of course they can be, and they can be very useful for some candidates to structure their work. But for instance, just have a look at B there on page 7. What do you think about George? Think about his relationship with Lenny, his relationship with other characters, the way he speaks and behaves. Anything else you think is important? Okay. The first 2 are pretty much going to be on foundation to start with, content-based, and then some discussion, and that they're really going to do it for them. And it may well be that they've already got as many marks as they're going to get using those first 2 bullets. They're going to do well with that. The third one is useful unless they start saying he stutters a lot and, suddenly we've got John Malkovich and not Lenny. That will happen. So we're actually looking at removing that one because of that very kind of thing that happens, because they tend to think of film actors. But, make them aware, if you are putting them in for foundation, that the bullets don't have to all be covered for them to achieve the marks. The same with the poetry. They don't have to work through every single bullet. The idea is that it gets them going, gives them some structure. The best essays won't be for even paragraphs, one on each of these bullets. So it's about, as I'm sure you know, it's about the individual kids and whether you think that they do better with a structure or whether they do better without. Practice tasks, I've been around it again, but that, at least that's there for you to have a look at, and even for them to have a look at and say, what do I like the look of more there? What do I feel more comfortable with? Yeah. Okay. We're really nearly out of time, so I'm just going to skim through the rest. Okay. We've got on pages 8 and 9 and onwards, you've got some slims, so you can see how that went. I think probably for you, the first couple of examples are very useful because you can see how we're awarding good marks. in terms of putting one in front of the candidates, I might start with one on page 13. We have a quick look at this. It's a foundation response as an extract. The impressions I get of Slim is, he seems quite messy and sounds like he doesn't wash when it says combed his long black damp straight hair. It's an interesting one because I can sort of see what they mean. I had loads of different interpretations of why his hair's damp. Yeah? He doesn't wash it. Ooh. He oils it, possible. He's been out working hard in the sun. Yeah? You know, there's lots of different reasons for why that might be. He's just had a shower because he's been working. There's lots of different... And you can't say you're wrong. You know, you give that a tick, you're selecting and discussing. They're engaging with the extract and they're engaging with the text, okay? Then we get, Slim does sound like a man to get on with because the other men on the ranch call him Jerkline Skinner. Now this time I don't see the connection. So, you know, that's what you need to point out to them, is that there isn't an obvious connection there, so that's not something that we can value as well. He seems to greet George and Lenny by saying to him, hope you get on my team. I think he said that because Lenny looks really muscular, which means he would be ideal for the job. Now again, I think that shows some sound understanding. It's a reasonable thing to say. Then I think he's talking about Slim again, or she is talking about Slim here rather than Lenny, when they say he looks good because he works hard, which is an aphorism that should go in every gym in the country, I think. But he looks good because he works hard is great, but develop it. And that's my point with this response, without labouring it. I think if you put this in front of candidates and say, I think this person knew a lot more than they've expressed here, and that they've expressed things very briefly. This is a typical what used to be the band which used to be ED. Let's put it that way. So we're talking something that is not going to help you at the beginning of a foundation paper when you're aiming for C. It's a 6 out of 10. You want an 8 out of 10. So how are you going to get that from 6 to 8? That's why I would start with. So it's not that difficult, is it? You can see that they made a couple more sensible points with some selection and discussion. Then, you know, they're going to get there. And it's that's why I would start with that one. And then go on to the better examples.